According to Muslim tradition, Nabella Henry was destined to marry young. So even when her parents picked a man Nabella despised, she honored their wishes.
I was just crying and I was scared. Everything was just wrong.
But just when Nabella thought she had found a way out, her husband would do the unthinkable.
Saad was punishing her. He didn't want her to be happy.
Saad's actions would send Nabella on a mission of a lifetime.
We feel this great fear that any moment we could be caught.
We knew there was a chance that I would go to jail, but that was a risk I was willing to take.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Growing up, Nabella Henry always knew what her destiny would be.
My dad is Lebanese and my mom is Egyptian. They're both Muslims. And, you know, your parents want you to follow the Arab background, the Muslim background. So we always knew we were going to get married young.
We went to school, came back, helped out with the family business, but the priority was to get us married and get us out.
By August of 1986, 16-year-old Nabella was a high school sophomore living in Miami, well aware that her single days were numbered.
I was at a birthday party. There was some Arab friends of my mom's, and my parents always taught us you pick up around and you clean up.
So while the party continued, Nabella brought dishes into the empty kitchen and quickly realized that she wasn't alone.
As I'm washing dishes, I could feel somebody staring at me. And I finally turned around to look, and it was this guy standing on the side, and he was drinking, and he was staring.
The man was a 28-year-old Lebanese computer engineer named Saad. And when Nabella's phone rang the following day, his intentions became clear.
I remember my mom getting a phone call in the kitchen. Oh, this nice guy, he's an engineer. He asked, that he would like to get to know you, and, I pleaded with my parents, especially my mom, that I don't want to meet him. I wasn't attracted to him. But, my parents thought that he had good potential, but I couldn't see me falling in love with him.
But Saad wasn't easily deterred. And before long, he showed up on Nabella's doorstep with the biggest, reddest apples the family had ever seen.
Every day he just started coming over my parents' house. And I used to feel so mad because I hated to see him. I felt like he was bothering me every day. He lived an hour away and he acted like he lived around the corner.
By the spring of 1987, Nabella's wedding date was set.
Saad never asked me to marry him. It just happened. I know that I couldn't get through to him. I didn't get through to my mom. And I wasn't going to talk to my dad. It was like everything that I did didn't make a difference.
That August, 17-year-old Nabella wed 29-year-old Saad in a wedding ceremony outside of Miami.
Our wedding was a blur. I remember my mom telling me to smile because everybody's gonna think something's wrong. And I remember talking to her in my head saying there is something wrong.
It was far from the wedding of her dreams, but the new bride had no idea of the tears that were yet to come. For the next 6 years, Nabella would be desperate to get away from Saad. But one day, the tables would suddenly turn. On Halloween weekend of 1993, Saad completely vanished from Nabella's life, and she would stop at nothing to track him down.
I was really scared. I was panicked. I didn't know what to do. So I called the police, and they just said they can't do anything for me.
Nabella Henry was about to face her worst nightmare. Would she ever see her husband again?
I would have never have thought that he would do something like that.
It got to a point where she didn't care what it took. Bella would risk anything.
By the fall of 1987, 6 years before her husband would suddenly vanish, married life already felt like prison for 17-year-old Nabella Henry. She had never been attracted to Saad and was far from the doting, domesticated wife he expected.
When I first got married, I was still in high school, so I didn't get to see him that much, which was great. You know, I wasn't thinking about being a wife or anything.
Nabella soon found out that she needed a few extra credits to graduate on time. So she enrolled in night school and savored the time away.
Basically, it's like having a double life, because I didn't wear my ring to school. I didn't tell nobody I was married. I even would hang with one of the girls that I met after school, and it was like being normal.
But when Saad found out about his wife's new friend, he was less than thrilled.
One night I come home and my parents are there at my house with Saad. And that's when they tell me that they don't think I should go to school no more. And you don't really have no say-so in the matter. I'm just like looking at them, and that was their decision, and I couldn't believe it.
Nabella dropped out of school, and over the next 2 years, her parents kept a watchful eye on their daughter by employing her at the family flea market. By January of 1989, it seemed their effort paid off, as Nabella and Saad welcomed their first child into the world.
After Ramsey was born, the excitement kicked in with this new little baby and being busy with him. You know, it brought me happiness. I mean, it was easier adjusting to motherhood than marriage, you know.
Life got even busier in June of 1991, when Nabella delivered a baby girl named Nora.
I just fell so in love with her. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And that's when I knew I'm gonna take these 2 kids and I'm gonna make a life.
By Nora's first birthday, the spark for her husband still wasn't there. Finally, Nabella told him she wanted a separation.
I told Saad, I've been with you for almost 5 years. I've never really been happy. I try to make it work. I try to be happy for the kids, but I just don't feel like pretending no more. And I still felt bad because, you know, here I am breaking up a family.
Just 3 weeks later, Saad lost his job and was forced to take a temporary position in Colorado, over 2,000 miles away. He pleaded with Nabella to join him. 6 months later, Saad flew home to find that nothing had changed for Nabella. In June of 1993, he hired a lawyer to begin divorce proceedings. But there was a catch.
He said he wants full custody and child support. I told him that this is America, that they tried to bring a mother and a child together. You know, I'm sure he knew that he was not going to get the kids.
Nabella decided to settle the matter in court. In the meantime, she and Saad split their time with the children.
The kids were with me Monday through Friday because Ramsey had school. So I told Saad, Friday night, you can pick Ramsey up from school and Nora from me, and then you can keep them till Sunday. And, you know, Saad and I would speak on the phone about where we would meet up for him to pick up the kids, because I did not want him to know where I lived.
Nabella was sure she had made the right decision. Saad, however, was far from pleased with the arrangement. And by Halloween weekend, he had another plan in store for Nabella.
We started to panic. We can't get in touch with him. The house phone's not working. Oh my God.
Nabella was about to lose everything.
I was just hysterical, crying. I wish he would have tried to kill me. At least I would have had a fighting chance.
By Halloween weekend of 1993, Nabella Henry and her husband Saad were sharing custody of their children and moving forward with a divorce.
After Saad got off of work, he comes picks up Nora for my job first, and then he'll go get Ramsey, and then he'll take him for the weekend.
But that Friday, when Saad stopped by around 6 p.m., it seemed that something else was on his mind.
He looks down and he says to me, "Are you happy now?" And I says to him, "I'm very happy. You can leave now." And the way he stared at me, I just felt something wasn't right.
On Sunday, October 31st at 5 p.m., Nabella called Saad to arrange a pickup location, but her call went unanswered.
We can't get in touch with him. The house phone's not working. Oh my God. We called everyone, everybody that he knew and her friends, and nobody's seen him.
By 7 o'clock, I called the police. By then, I was just hysterical, crying. You know, he took my kids. I don't know where they are. And they're like, who is he? And when I tell them that he's the father and that we don't have no custody order in place yet, they said there's nothing you can do. That's their father.
Nabella had no idea what to do next. Until the following day when she got in touch with Saad's best friend.
I asked him, have you heard from Saad? And he says he hasn't heard from him, but he's received a letter from him. And in the letter, he says either he takes the children to Lebanon or he kills me. So he just took the children. I wish he would have tried to kill me. At least I would have had a fighting chance.
Nabella knew that getting the children back from Lebanon would be no easy feat.
Lebanon is not part of the Hague Treaty. They don't acknowledge any court orders from the U.S. and they will not help you with getting back the children or any other issue. So, you know, I'm thinking, how am I going to get over there? And how am I going to get my kids?
Nabella called the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon, but was told all they could do was check to make sure the children were okay.
A week later, they contacted me back, and they said that, you know, my kids are enrolled in a school, and they're fine. And then Saad called me. We didn't speak about him taking the children. I couldn't get mad with him. I couldn't show him anger because I had to talk to my kids. You know, I had to keep everything nice.
Meanwhile, Nabella continued to call U.S. authorities and was able to talk to her children nearly every other week. But as the months dragged on, progress only came in the form of a finalized divorce from Saad, and she was granted full custody of the kids, should they ever return. Nabella was running out of patience.
Sometimes you lose hope. Sometimes you have hope. But, you know, I kept making phone calls to anybody that would listen.
It seemed like whatever she did, there was a roadblock. What was she gonna do now?
By the winter of 1995, 2 long years after her children were taken, Nabella finally received the break she had been waiting for when she reached out to an organization that specializes in cases like her own.
American Association for Lost Children is a nonprofit charity that finds and rescues missing children at no cost to the parents. Nabella contacted me about her 2 children that were missing, and I was willing to help her and look into it.
Mark said he thinks he can help me. I was so excited. I mean, I wasn't 100% sure if we can get my kids back, but we were working on something.
By the following August, Mark Miller and his associate Patricia Moore had devised a plan. In late October, they would travel with Nabella to Lebanon and attempt to retrieve the children in a dangerous covert operation.
For us, going into Lebanon meant that we were really putting our lives in danger.
We knew we were taking a chance on being there. We knew it was risky. And we also knew there was a chance that I would go to jail. But that was a risk I was willing to take.
On October 27th, the trio arrived in Beirut, and early the next morning took a cab to the children's school. When they arrived, Nabella and Pat rushed into the crowded schoolyard searching for the children.
I started asking the kids that look like they're around 7, do you know Ramsey? Do you know Ramsey? And maybe the 4th or 5th child, she says to me, yeah, I know him. There he goes. And when I look, he's looking down into his book bag. So I walk up to him and I'm like, Ramsey. And he looks up and I'm like, do you know who I am? And he goes, yeah, Mommy.
She just grabs his hand and we just continue our pace in our walk. Nabella put Ramsey in the back seat with Mark, and at this point, our fear level has quadrupled. We could have been seen. We don't know. But we know that we're gonna go find Nora.
Nabella's mission to retrieve the children was far from over, and disaster could be right around the corner.
And I'm like, Patty, is she coming? Did she see us? And she's like, just go, go, go.
We've got to keep moving forward to get out of the country. I started to think that we may not make it back.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On October 28, 1996, Nabella Henry was in the midst of a dangerous mission to retrieve her children from Lebanon. With her son Ramsey safely in the taxi, Nabella and Pat Moore returned to the school to find Nabella's daughter.
The principal just happens to walk out of the school. And she's like, how can I help you? So I'm like, I'm looking for my daughter because I have to give her lunch money. She says, okay. By then, she's in her little office.
At that moment, the principal had to get up and leave the building. And when she disappeared, Nabella didn't ask any questions at all. She got up and started walking down the hallway where we saw a door open.
I stepped to the side and I asked this third little child, do you know Nora? And she turns around and she goes, yeah, there she goes, right behind her. I just look, I'm like, Nora? She looks up, that's my girl.
Nora looked up and she said, Mommy. And she hadn't seen Mommy in 3 years. So Nabella just picked her up, just grabbed her.
Pat is like pushing my back, go, go, go. And my knees are just about to give way.
You feel this great fear that someone is behind you. So by the time we got to the car, there's this feeling of accomplishment that your story's not done yet.
Knowing that they had to leave the country before Saad found out, the group quickly made their way to the airport.
Mark and Pat, they kept trying not to make me worry. Like, they kept saying, talk to the kids, don't let them be worried. So I would turn around and I'm so happy to see them and I kissed them, but I'm so scared.
At the airport, Mark and Pat bought 5 tickets to Paris, France, the only available flight out of Beirut that day. They told Nabella they would have to go their separate ways.
We decided the best thing for all of us was to separate.
Patricia and I are going to go together like we're a couple, and Nabella and her children will be on a separate line.
But as Nabella went through customs with the children, everything came to a screeching halt.
They look at our passports, and he looks again, and then he was like, why aren't the kids' passports stamped? You came in last night, right? And then I says, yes. And I'm trying to act like everything is fine.
I asked Pat if she could walk around the corner and just glance down at the checkpoint. And so then she come back and she said that Nabella was still there talking to the guy.
I'm like dying inside, you know, scared, shaking, and they're on the phone, and I hear him saying it's impossible. She came in last night, and all I know is he says, if you're gonna make the plane, you better hurry up and run.
Moments later, all 5 of them boarded the plane bound for Paris.
When the plane took off, we cried. We cried, and we couldn't believe it. And that's when Ramsey asks me, Mom, why are you crying?
She said that she's crying because she's happy. That's my one crystal clear memory of the plane.
The following day, when they arrived back in the States, the group couldn't believe the celebration that awaited them.
My whole family was there. You were surrounded by so many people that are so happy to see you. So it was definitely a good feeling.
On October 30th, only 2 days after she left Lebanon with the kids, Nabella received a phone call from Saad.
He was crying, saying he can't eat and he can't sleep. And I told him, I know you can't eat, I know you can't sleep, because that's exactly what I went through.
Nabella feared that Saad might return for the children, so she kept her eyes on them at all times.
She was scared, she was unnerved, she wasn't sure what could happen, so we were loved and smothered. But we weren't complaining, because we wanted that too.
Today, Nabella Henry is happily remarried and now the mother of 4.
I met my husband, Michael, at work, and he was just a nice guy. And Ramsey and Nora have so much respect for Michael. That's their dad.
Now in their 20s and both enrolled in college, Ramsey and Nora are happy, healthy, and still the light of their mother's eye.
They're very close, and I'm very close to them, and I would do anything for them. They know that. There's nothing I wouldn't do.
My mom is definitely me and my sister's hero. You know, for what she did for us. We can never repay her.
Even though Saad never returned for the children, the hurt still lingers. But Nabella is sure of one thing. Customs of the past have no place in her future.
I think everybody should choose who they want to in life, despite race, religion, anything. Only you know who you can click with. And I just feel glad I got to pick my own.
Adrian Solomon thought professional gambler Ernie Shearer was a risk worth taking.
I had never wanted to have a long-distance relationship, but this seemed to work for both of us.
He assured her that he was really true to her. I liked him.
But something dark lurked behind Ernie's poker face.
There was some things that were a little bit off.
Adrian would soon realize Ernie's entire life was built on a house of cards.
This was one of the most brutal cases I had seen in my entire 33-year career.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. For Adrian Solomon, life was one big adventure.
I went to work on Wall Street and then decided I wanted to do something completely different. So I applied for a job at a resort, lived all over the world, taught people how to fly on the trapeze. So essentially I ran away and joined the circus.
By age 34, Adrian had been globetrotting for years. But when she left the resort industry for an event planning career, there was one place she had yet to visit: Las Vegas. So in April 2006, Adrian jumped at the chance to head to Sin City for a week-long work convention.
When I first got there, I was just walking around a little bit, trying to get a feel for the place, and I ended up over at the craps table.
Adrian was fascinated by the riveting numbers game, so much so that she barely noticed the stranger standing next to her. But he certainly noticed her.
He could see I looked a little bit confused, and so he asked if I wanted him to explain the game to me.
As the two began to chat, Adrian realized she had met the ultimate Vegas persona, a professional poker player named Ernie Shearer.
When he asked if I wanted to go out to dinner that night, I was a little bit hesitant at first because I didn't know who this person was.
But Adrian decided to roll the dice. That night, she joined Ernie for dinner.
It was one of those very good, relaxed first dates. We talked about how close we both were with our families. I learned that he had grown up in a Mormon household, and I was asking him lots of questions about it.
Ernie told Adrian that despite his Mormon upbringing, playing poker was his passion. He lived in California, but spent much of his time in Vegas for tournaments.
At the end of the night, we said goodnight and made plans to see each other the next day.
While in Vegas, Adrian and Ernie had several more casual dates. When they said goodbye, Adrian wasn't sure if their time together would amount to anything more than a fling. But 3 weeks later, the two met up in California, then Florida, and soon they were crisscrossing the country to see each other.
Ernie obviously cared about Adrian because it was a long-distance relationship, but he assured her that he was really true to her.
After a few months of dating, we had a conversation one day and decided that our relationship would be an exclusive one.
So I thought, okay, if she likes him, I liked him.
Things seemed to be going so well for the new couple. But there was one thing about Ernie that troubled Adrian.
He never let me see his home. His reasoning was that I lived in this really nice condo and his apartment was just horrible and he was not proud of it.
She was concerned that Ernie would never take her to his apartment, and she talked to him endlessly about it, and he came up with one excuse or the other.
A lot of my friends said it's the male ego. He cannot stand the fact that you have somewhere nicer than he does.
Adrian decided to give Ernie time to come around. But 2 years into their relationship, she still hadn't seen Ernie's apartment. To make matters worse, it seems she had been shunned by his parents.
It was definitely an issue in their relationship.
But all of this would soon be overshadowed by frightening and tragic events. It all started in April 2008, while Adrian was on a business trip in San Francisco.
I was in my hotel room doing some work and received an email from a woman that Ernie and I had known. And the email said that she was so sorry to hear about his parents, and I had no idea what this email was in reference to.
Concerned, Adrian did an internet search for Ernie's parents, and the story she saw was jaw-dropping.
I couldn't really believe what I was actually reading.
We were shocked and wanted to reach out to Ernie because we felt so bad for him.
In the fall of 2006, 2 years before getting dreadful news about Ernie Shearer's parents, Adrian Solomon was taking a gamble on her new man.
We lived on opposite coasts, and that worked very well. Both of us had careers where we were on the road a lot.
They could travel together and do all sorts of things together that someone that had a 9-to-5, very structured job couldn't do.
Despite the distance between them, Adrian and Ernie were flourishing. And one day, while on a trip to Vegas, Ernie made it clear he was thinking about their future together.
We were walking through some of the stores and saw a beautiful ring, and we both completely fell in love with this ring. And he said, let's try it on.
They had only been dating for several months, and Adrian knew an engagement was a tad premature. But it still felt like a natural step.
The fact that we both wanted to look at it was really exciting. So it definitely felt like we were moving towards this being that type of relationship where we would eventually get married.
He talked to me about wanting to marry her and wanting to talk to my husband and get his permission. And he also talked about children. He wanted to have at least 2 children.
But for Adrian, there was one big problem.
He knew my entire extended family, you know, cousins and everybody, and I didn't know his family.
She was concerned that she wasn't able to meet them. She talked to Ernie at length about it.
But every time Adrian asked to meet Ernie's parents, he refused and blamed his mother.
He said his mother was not comfortable with our relationship. She did not like the fact that I am not Mormon, that I was older than him. She seemed to have a lot of negative thoughts about me. And this was very hard for me.
But in the fall of 2007, Adrian's luck would change. One day, she and Ernie happened to be in Las Vegas at the same time as Ernie's father.
So Ernie said, okay, you're finally gonna get to meet my father. So I was excited and a little bit nervous.
Making a good impression meant the world to Adrian. But that evening, the unthinkable happened.
So we get down to the lobby, and he goes to introduce us and says, you know, this is my father, and this is, turns to introduce me. And his father said, I know who she is, and turned his back to me. And I'm standing there with my hand out, ready to shake his hand. I don't think I've ever been as insulted in my life.
Adrian was crushed, but Ernie's reaction took the cake.
He said, oh, so you finally met my father? And I said, no, I didn't meet your father. I just got completely snubbed by your father. He's like, oh, really?
Ernie seemed completely oblivious to the situation, almost pretending it hadn't even happened.
He somehow did not see that his father treated me like that.
The incident hung like a cloud over the couple's relationship. And over the next 6 months, Adrian realized there were too many things about Ernie that just didn't sit well.
He had this mentality that he was always right and he was smarter than everyone else. His ego was huge and was quick to anger.
It seemed like there was something that wasn't quite right there, and that made me a little nervous.
Adrian also began to notice troubling signs that Ernie's gambling habits were escalating.
I did get a little bit concerned about his sports betting because the amounts got bigger and he seemed to get more and more vested in it. He could not watch a sporting event without having a bet on it. He also was not doing very well at the poker tables.
My sister started to tell me that Ernie was losing a lot of money and he was in some financial trouble.
The cautious professional Adrian thought she knew was turning into someone else.
Our personalities were not right to be in a romantic relationship. I realized that this relationship wasn't going to be forever.
In February 2008, Adrian and Ernie broke up.
We didn't talk about staying friends. We both had some hard feelings.
But less than a month later, a tragedy would bring Adrian and Ernie back together.
The victims had been inside for several days. There was a tremendous amount of blood.
There was such a tangled web of lies in Ernie's life.
In the spring of 2008, 3 weeks after breaking up with Ernie Shearer, Adrian Solomon was in San Francisco for work. She had been doing just fine until she received a troubling email from an acquaintance.
And the email said that she was so sorry to hear about Ernie's parents and is there anything that she can do for us? And I thought, what on earth is this? So I decided to look up his parents online.
And what Adrian saw was frightening.
I learned that they had been murdered. And the bodies had just been found, and I was completely shocked.
Ernie's parents had been beaten to death in their Northern California home.
To think that somebody had done this in a very brutal fashion, it was really scary.
Adrian's shock quickly turned to concern for Ernie.
He had been my best friend for 2 years, and I thought it was important for me to be there for him. So I shot him a text and just said, I heard, I'm so sorry, let me know if there's anything I can do. And he called me back pretty soon after that.
Ernie was distraught, and Adrian did what she could to console him. When Adrian returned home to North Carolina later that week, it was with a heavy heart. Meanwhile, back in California, police were working around the clock to determine who could have committed such a brutal double murder.
When we first got there, it appeared that it may have been a burglary. There was stuff thrown about. There was jewelry that appeared to have been looked through.
But as investigators looked closer, they realized that nothing seemed to have been stolen.
We kind of figured it was just staged to look like a burglary.
Detectives now wondered, was the killer someone who knew the victims?
This case here was probably one of the most brutal cases I had seen in my career. Both the victims were in their pajamas. Both of them just fought for their lives until the bitter end, and it was just horrible.
There were no obvious suspects, but that was about to change. On Easter Sunday, 2008, Adrian was at home in North Carolina when she got a frantic call from Ernie.
He told me that the cops had started focusing their investigation on him. They had gotten a warrant and searched his house. They had taken his computer. He really felt like they were harassing him.
Ernie claimed police were simply using him as a scapegoat because they lacked other suspects. He said he needed to get out of town and asked if he could join Adrian on an upcoming business trip to Dallas.
I told him it was going to make him look guilty.
But Ernie was insistent.
So I told him that was fine. He was going to be getting his own hotel room, but I'd be happy to go out and have dinner with him in Dallas.
Adrienne felt sorry for Ernie's misfortune, but that wouldn't last long. A few days later, she received one of the most shocking phone calls of her life.
So I was in a taxi heading to my hotel in Dallas, and my phone rang. It was a restricted number, so I thought it would be Ernie, but it wasn't. It was a detective on the investigation. He said, "I know that you've broken up, but how long did this affair go on?" And I was taken aback. I said, "That's a very harsh word for you to be using." We were in an exclusive relationship for 2 years.
And that's when the detective dropped a bombshell.
He said, "Oh, so you don't know that he's married and has a child?" And I was completely shocked. I thought he was telling me these things to try to get me angry. I thought he was trying to make me mad at Ernie so that I would say things about him.
But soon after hanging up, Adrienne's doubts turned into a horrifying certainty.
It probably took my brain about 10 seconds to go through all of the fights and every issue that we ever had and realize, wow, he was married and has a child. This is why his parents wouldn't talk to me. It's not because I'm not a Mormon, it's because he's married. And this is why I wasn't able to see his house.
It seemed bluffing was not just Ernie's profession, it was also his way of life.
All of the things that I was learning were just mind-boggling.
Adrienne couldn't help but wonder, if Ernie had lied to her every day for 2 years, what else was he capable of?
He was meeting me in Dallas. He was going to be there in a short time, and he might have killed his parents. I was terrified.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. The afternoon of April 1st, 2008, Adrienne Solomon arrived at her Dallas hotel. She was in town for work, but suddenly this was no ordinary business trip. Her ex-boyfriend, Ernie Shearer, was also in town and heading her way.
It was just crazy to think that someone that I had dated for 2 years is now under serious suspicion of murdering his parents. And I was terrified. So when I got to the hotel, I asked the person at the front desk to unregister my name.
And as Ernie arrived, Adrienne asked co-workers to keep a watchful eye on her while she met him in the hotel lobby.
He walked in, tried to give me a hug, and I backed up. And we started talking. I said, "Well, I know you're married." And he said, "Well, it's in name only. We are not actually, in any kind of relationship. We just have not gotten divorced."
Ernie admitted he hadn't been honest with Adrienne about his personal life, but he insisted he wasn't capable of murder.
He said, "I did some horrible things. I know, I'm so sorry for that, but I could never murder my parents."
Adrienne found herself believing Ernie.
He was guilty of being a really mean, horrible person and an adulterer, but not a murderer. Those two things were on a different scale.
Still, Ernie had betrayed Adrienne's trust, and while she wasn't sure he was guilty, she knew she never wanted to see him again. Meanwhile, back in California, investigators had no such doubts. They were certain Ernie Shearer was their man.
Within 5 months, we knew that he had killed his mom and dad. We had approximately 35 items of circumstantial evidence.
Among that evidence, disturbing details of Ernie's financial downslide.
We looked at his gambling, and he had some serious debts that he had to pay off in regards to the gambling, in excess of $100,000.
According to detectives, Ernie was also behind on mortgage payments, and he owed his father a substantial amount of money. Money Ernie was due to pay back.
The dad was actually killed a week before one of the payments were supposed to be made.
To top it all off, Ernie stood to inherit at least $1 million from his parents. But the key piece of evidence came from a security camera mounted at the entrance to the Shearers' gated community.
One of my detectives was going through hours and hours of these tapes, and she came across a red convertible Camaro that went into the property on March 7th around 8:30 and left the property around 12:30 a.m.
Right around the time detectives believed the murders had happened. The cameras weren't able to capture a license plate number, but the car was a familiar one. It was the same make and model driven by Ernie Shearer.
To me, that was an oh my God moment.
The evidence was circumstantial, but to detectives, it all added up.
How many coincidences can you have when it's not a coincidence anymore?
Detectives were certain the motive was financial gain. On February 25, 2009, Ernie Shearer was arrested in Las Vegas. He was charged with first-degree murder. On March 28, 2011, after a 2-month trial, a jury convicted Ernie Shearer of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison without parole. In the months that followed Ernie's conviction, Adrienne steeled herself to move on.
It was a hard road. I think the hardest part for me was trusting again. But I think I'm happier now than I've ever been.
Adrienne is doing terrific. She's strong and has her head on straight. That's been healing for her.
Through it all, Adrienne managed to keep her thirst for adventure intact. And today, she's embarked on a new kind of journey.
I've actually been able to start my own company, which is very exciting. Doing event planning, and I absolutely love it.
But as for taking another gamble on love, for Adrienne, the odds are 50-50.
If I meet someone and I get in a relationship, that's great. But right now, I'm just concentrating on enjoying life.
It begins with a sound no one ever forgets once they've heard it. The sharp crack of a screen door slamming shut in the middle of the night, followed by silence so thick it feels intentional, as if the dark itself is holding its breath. And in a quiet California town in the spring of 1998, that sound was the last ordinary thing anyone heard before an entire community learned what a cold case feels like, not as a phrase in a headline, but as a weight that settles into your chest and refuses to leave, because by morning a young woman was gone, her car still parked crooked in the driveway, her purse on the kitchen counter, her coffee half finished and cooling beside the sink, and the air inside the house carried that wrongness investigators talk about years later. The sense that time has been disturbed and something irreversible has already happened. Her name was mentioned first on police radios, then whispered across school hallways, then printed in block letters on the front page of a local paper. And every repetition seemed to strip away a little more disbelief until the words missing and California and 1998 fused together into a single phrase that people would repeat for decades, because this wasn't the kind of place where people vanished without explanation, not the kind of town where parents double-locked their doors or neighbors ignored screams, a town where faces were familiar and routines were predictable, where the biggest news most weeks was a zoning dispute or a high school football upset, until suddenly everything familiar became suspicious, and every routine felt like a mistake waiting to be discovered. Police arrived before sunrise, lights flashing against quiet houses, the blue and red reflections sliding across windows where people stood watching in their robes, pretending not to stare while committing every detail to memory, because in moments like this memory feels like protection. And inside the house, officers moved carefully, noting what wasn't there as much as what was: no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no obvious struggle, just absence, clean and terrifying, the kind that suggests trust or surprise or both. And immediately the questions started stacking up faster than answers ever could, because a missing person without chaos leaves investigators with nothing to chase but possibilities. And possibilities are where cases go to lose their shape. By mid-morning, the term cold case wasn't being used yet, but the groundwork was already being laid. because leads came in messy and contradictory. A neighbor who thought they heard a car at 2:17 a.m., another who swore the street was silent, a gas station clerk who maybe recognized her face, or maybe just wanted to be helpful. And every tip went onto paper, into boxes, into files that would grow heavier with each passing year, while detectives walked the neighborhood again and again, hoping repetition might reveal what instinct missed the first time, hoping a footprint or a dropped fiber might suddenly decide to matter. But the ground had already given up its secrets to the ordinary passage of life. The victim's routine was reconstructed like a fragile timeline: work, home, phone calls logged and relogged, names circled, crossed out, circled again, friends interviewed until their voices cracked from repeating the same answers, family members sitting under fluorescent lights trying to remember details that felt insulting in their normality: what she ate for dinner, whether she locked the door, whether she mentioned anyone unusual. And the cruelty of it all was that nothing stood out, because most lives are built from uneventful days, and uneventful days don't explain why someone disappears without a trace. As days turned into weeks, the town transformed under the pressure. Posters stapled to poles and taped inside store windows, faces staring back at passers-by with eyes that seemed to ask for help directly, candlelight vigils held in parking lots where people cried together even when they didn't know each other's names, and every night the news repeated the same phrases: no suspects, investigation ongoing, anyone with information urged to come forward. Words that sound proactive but feel hollow when time keeps moving and the missing person does not come back with it. Detectives chased what they could. An ex-boyfriend scrutinized, co-workers questioned, a mechanic interviewed about a repair that suddenly felt sinister simply because it existed, and each potential suspect carried the same fatal flaw: nothing that held, nothing that could survive contact with facts, because suspicion without evidence dissolves quickly, and the law does not run on feelings no matter how strong they are, and quietly, without ceremony. The investigation slowed, not because anyone gave up, but because there was nowhere left to run. The case file grew thick enough to earn its label: cold case, stamped not as an admission of failure but as a classification of reality, a recognition that some mysteries do not yield on demand, and years passed in the way they always do, unevenly, with anniversaries that felt sharper than other days, with new detectives inheriting old questions, flipping through yellowing reports and wondering what their predecessors might have missed. And outside the station, life continued. Houses changed, owners, children grew up, and the missing woman's name became something older residents remembered clearly while newcomers learned it only as a story, a cautionary tale wrapped in local history. Technology changed quietly in the background. Databases expanded. Forensic science refined itself. DNA analysis evolved from something rare and experimental into a standard tool. And yet the evidence from 1998 remained stubbornly silent, preserved carefully, waiting for a moment no one could predict, because cold cases are not dormant, they are patient, and patience is their most dangerous quality, allowing years to pass without resolution, while the truth remains intact, untouched by time. For the family, time did not heal anything. It only rearranged the pain, turning shock into endurance, hope into a quieter, more disciplined thing that learned to exist without answers. Birthdays marked with absence, holidays spent imagining what might have been, and every knock at the door carrying a flicker of expectation that never quite died. Because as long as there was no body, no confession, no certainty, the story remained unfinished, suspended between past and possibility. Inside the evidence room, sealed and catalogued, items from the night of her disappearance waited. Fibers, samples, objects that once felt insignificant and now carried the full weight of expectation, and investigators who believed in the slow justice of science would occasionally return to them, checking, rechecking, comparing against databases that grew larger every year, knowing that the answer, if it existed, would not announce itself dramatically. It would arrive quietly, as a match, as a probability, as a line of data that refused to be ignored. By the time the calendar edged toward the 21st century's second decade, the case had become a fixture of institutional memory, mentioned during training sessions, referenced in hushed tones by veterans who remembered the early days, and still, officially, unsolved, a California 1998 cold case that resisted closure, that lingered like a question no one wanted to ask out loud anymore, because asking meant admitting how little progress time alone can guarantee, and yet somewhere within, that accumulated silence, within those boxes and files and samples, the truth remained present, waiting for a single moment of alignment, a future in which science would finally speak, where witnesses and intuition had failed. And when it did, it would not just reopen an old case, it would reopen every wound that had learned to scar over, dragging the past back into the present with a force no one in that town was prepared for. The first real fracture in the silence didn't come with sirens or headlines. It came with a phone call made long after midnight, the kind that drags detectives out of half-sleep and into that familiar mental space where hope and skepticism collide, because someone, somewhere, suddenly remembered something or claimed they did, a detail that had sat unnoticed for years before resurfacing with the weight of urgency. And when the report landed on a desk already crowded with old paperwork, it didn't look extraordinary at first, just another tip, another voice reaching out from the dark. But cold cases don't move forward on grand gestures. They inch forward on fragments, on slivers of recollection that refuse to stay buried. The tip pointed not to a stranger but to someone uncomfortably close, a name already present in the file, underlined years earlier and then quietly set aside, not because the person was cleared beyond doubt, but because doubt alone had never been enough. And detectives pulled the box again, lifting its lid with the same mix of anticipation and dread they had learned to associate with this case, because reopening a cold case is an admission that time might matter less than persistence, and persistence can be exhausting when every answer seems to dissolve under scrutiny. They read old interviews, listened to cassette recordings where voices sounded younger, less guarded, less aware of how permanence works, noting the pauses, the inconsistencies that once felt trivial, the phrases that suddenly carried a different weight now that years had passed and lives had shifted, because people change but facts do not, and sometimes the gap between who someone was and who they became is where the truth finally slips through. The town barely noticed at first, because cold cases reopening rarely announce themselves. There are no parades for renewed investigation, just unmarked cars parked a little longer than usual, detectives asking questions that haven't been heard in years, neighbors wondering why familiar names are being spoken again, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air tightens, because everyone remembers how this story started, and everyone knows what it would mean if it ended badly. Investigators retrace steps with modern eyes, mapping movements using technology that didn't exist in 1998, cell towers that could now whisper about proximity, databases that could cross-reference patterns at speeds once unimaginable, and still, nothing definitive emerged, only probabilities, only shadows of what might have been. But cold cases thrive in that space between certainty and suspicion, because that's where patience becomes strategy. They revisited physical evidence, gloved hands lifting items sealed decades earlier, the smell of old paper and plastic filling the room, each object representing a moment frozen in time, and forensic specialists treated them with reverence, because this was not just evidence, it was a conversation with the past, and the past does not repeat itself. It waits to be understood. DNA testing had advanced quietly, almost arrogantly, since the late 90s, transforming from an expensive novelty into a cornerstone of modern justice, and samples once considered unusable were now viable. Fragments once dismissed as contaminated were suddenly worth a second look. And when technicians prepared the materials, there was no dramatic music, no countdown, just routine. Because science does its most powerful work without spectacle. Results didn't come immediately, they never do. And that waiting period stretched into weeks that felt heavier than years, because anticipation sharpens anxiety, and detectives learn to manage expectations, reminding themselves that most tests come back inconclusive, that hope is not a plan. And yet, When the notification finally arrived, it didn't say what anyone expected. It didn't offer a name, not yet, but it did offer something almost as dangerous. A partial profile, incomplete but unmistakably human, a genetic whisper from someone who had been there, someone who had left behind proof without knowing it would one day matter. That fragment changed everything, not loudly, not publicly, but internally, within the walls of the department, because now the case had momentum, and momentum in a cold case is a rare and volatile thing, capable of reigniting attention, but also capable of collapsing under its own weight if mishandled. So investigators moved carefully, expanding the search, feeding the profile into growing databases, watching as the net widened beyond anything imaginable in 1998. The community began to sense the shift, rumors moving faster than official statements, whispers of new evidence circulating through coffee shops and online forums, old theories resurfacing, names being spoken again with a mixture of excitement and fear, because a solved cold case doesn't just deliver justice, it rewrites memory, forcing everyone to re-examine where they were, what they believed, who they trusted. For the family, the news arrived with restraint, a careful phone call, measured language, no promises, just the acknowledgement that the case was active again, that something had changed, and that was enough to reopen emotional doors they had learned to keep closed, because hope, once reintroduced, does not ask permission, it demands space, and suddenly the future felt uncertain in a new and dangerous way. Detectives followed the genetic trail outward, not toward a suspect, but toward relatives, distant connections, people who had no idea their DNA could one day pull them into a story they never agreed to be part of. And this is the strange new frontier of cold case investigation, where identity could be inferred, where family trees became investigative tools, and privacy collided with justice in ways the law was still learning how to navigate. Each connection narrowed the field, each exclusion sharpened the outline of someone still unnamed, and with every step, the past grew closer, more defined, until it felt less like history and more like something unfinished pressing against the present, demanding resolution, and investigators felt the pressure building, because now there was something to lose, a chance that could slip away if mishandled. As the pieces aligned, one name began to surface with unsettling familiarity, not as a suspect yet, not officially, but as a figure whose proximity to the victim suddenly looked different under modern scrutiny, whose past interactions, once considered benign, now felt weighted with possibility, and detectives approached this realization with caution, because accusation without confirmation is the fastest way to destroy a case that has waited decades for its moment. They gathered quietly, reviewing timelines, aligning genetic data with opportunity, with motive, with access, and the convergence was slow, but unmistakable, a pattern emerging where randomness once reigned, and in that moment, the case crossed an invisible threshold, shifting from mystery to impending revelation, from unanswered questions to a truth that was beginning to take shape. Outside, life continued as it always had, unaware that beneath its routines, beneath its comfort, an old story was moving toward an ending no one had imagined in 1998, an ending that would not arrive gently, that would not allow the town to remember the case as safely unsolved, because when science finally points its finger, it does so without nostalgia, without mercy, and the past, once awakened, does not return quietly to sleep. The name didn't surface all at once. It emerged the way truth often does in cold cases, indirectly, through the edges of other people's lives, through family trees that branched and rebranched until one limb pointed back toward the town everyone thought they understood. And when investigators finally saw it written clearly on the board, there was no celebration, no moment of triumph, only a long silence, because recognition carries its own kind of dread, especially when the person in question is not a stranger pulled from nowhere, but someone whose face had once blended easily into the background of daily life. He had lived close enough to be ordinary, close enough to be overlooked, his name appearing in early interviews without triggering alarms, his presence explained by familiarity rather than suspicion, and that familiarity had protected him for years because people rarely question what feels normal, and normality is the most effective camouflage a perpetrator can wear. Detectives moved cautiously, verifying every detail, because cold cases collapse when enthusiasm outruns evidence, and they rebuilt the timeline with an almost obsessive precision, aligning work schedules, travel records, financial transactions, moments that could now be anchored to dates and times with far more accuracy than was possible in 1998. And what emerged was not a smoking gun, but a pattern of opportunity. Small gaps where explanations thinned and silence filled the space instead. They reviewed his past statements, comparing them against the present, listening for the subtle shifts that occur when someone tells the same story years apart, noting changes in emphasis, in language, in what was remembered too clearly, and what had faded too conveniently, because memory degrades unevenly and inconsistencies are often less about lies than about what someone is trying not to revisit. When detectives approached him again, it wasn't with handcuffs or accusations, just questions, calm and rehearsed, framed as routine, because confrontation closes doors while curiosity keeps them open. And in those early conversations, he was cooperative, even helpful, offering details freely, leaning into the role of someone with nothing to hide. And yet something about the exchanges felt rehearsed, as if he had spent years preparing for this moment without ever knowing when it would arrive. Behind the scenes, the genetic profile continued to do its quiet work, narrowing probabilities, strengthening associations, transforming what had once been circumstantial into something more concrete, and forensic analysts spoke in careful language, percentages and likelihoods rather than absolutes, because science does not declare guilt, it offers proximity, and proximity, when layered with motive and opportunity, becomes powerful. The decision to collect a fresh DNA sample was debated intensely, because such requests are legal minefields, and one misstep could poison the entire case. So investigators waited, watched, gathered peripheral evidence, building a structure strong enough to support the weight of what they hoped to prove, knowing that when they finally asked, the answer would matter almost as much as the sample itself. The request came quietly, framed as voluntary, a standard procedure in reopened cases, and his reaction was immediate but controlled, a pause just long enough to register, followed by agreement that sounded reasonable, almost casual, and it was in that pause that detectives felt the case tighten. Because fear rarely announces itself loudly, it flickers, briefly visible before being covered by composure. The sample was processed with the same routine care as the others, logged, labeled, fed into machines that did not care about reputation or history, or how much time had passed. And while the lab worked, investigators prepared for two futures, one where the match confirmed their instincts, and one where it erased years of renewed suspicion. Because cold cases teach humility as brutally as they teach patience. When the results came back, they did not arrive as a dramatic revelation, just a report, clinical and restrained, but within its lines was a conclusion that changed the gravity of the room, a match strong enough to erase coincidence, strong enough to justify the next step. And suddenly the past was no longer abstract. It had a name, a genetic signature, a presence that could no longer be ignored. The weight of that knowledge pressed inward, because solving a cold case is not a clean victory. It is an emotional detonation delayed by decades, and investigators understood that what came next would ripple outward, through families, through the community, through their own sense of justice, because the truth, once named, demands to be acted upon. Plans were made with precision, arrest warrants drafted, prosecutors briefed, every word scrutinized for weakness, because cases built on old evidence must withstand modern skepticism, and any error could unravel years of effort in a single courtroom exchange. So nothing was rushed, even as urgency crept in, fueled by the knowledge that time, once again, was a factor. Outside the station, the town moved through its routines, unaware that the man they passed at the grocery store, the neighbor they nodded to, the acquaintance they recognized without thinking, was now at the center of a story that had been waiting 25 years to conclude. And the proximity of that reality was unsettling, because it suggested that the line between safety and danger had always been thinner than anyone wanted to admit. When the arrest finally came, it did not unfold in the dramatic way people imagine from television. There were no sirens screaming through the streets, just quiet efficiency, officers approaching with calm authority, hands placed carefully, rights read in measured tones, and in that moment, the cold case crossed into a new phase, no longer a question of what happened, but of how it would be proven and how the community would absorb a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The arrest didn't feel like closure, it felt like exposure, as if a layer of the town had been peeled back to reveal something everyone had walked over for years without noticing. And the moment his name entered the public record, the community reacted in waves, shock first, then denial, then a restless need to understand how someone so familiar could be connected to something so brutal, because cold cases don't just end when an arrest is made. They begin again, louder, messier, pulling everyone back into a story they thought time had softened. News vans lined the street outside the station, microphones angled toward doors that stayed firmly shut, and headlines moved fast, faster than facts, repeating the same charged phrases again and again. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. Suspect in custody after 25 years. And with each repetition, the narrative hardened, turning decades of uncertainty into a single, irreversible moment, even though inside the case was still fragile, still dependent on evidence that would now be dissected by defense attorneys trained to exploit every gap left by time. Investigators returned to the evidence with renewed urgency, not to find something new, but to ensure what they already had could withstand the glare of scrutiny, re-examining chain of custody logs, revisiting old lab reports, confirming that every step taken decades earlier aligned with modern standards, because cold cases are uniquely vulnerable, built from pieces collected in a different era, under different assumptions, and any inconsistency, no matter how small, could be amplified into reasonable doubt. Witnesses were contacted again, voices older now, memories dulled at the edges, and some refused to talk, unwilling to reopen wounds they had learned to live with, while others spoke eagerly, relieved that the weight they carried might finally be lifted, and detectives navigated these conversations carefully, knowing that memory after 25 years is less about accuracy and more about narrative, shaped by retellings, by media coverage, by the quiet internal edits people make to survive. The suspect's past was dissected in parallel. Every movement in 1998 reconstructed with forensic attention, work records, phone bills, bank transactions, fragments of a life frozen in a year that had suddenly become relevant again, and patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, not cinematic revelations, but small consistencies that align too well with opportunity, too well with access, the kind of details that never matter alone, but become damning when assembled patiently. Defense attorneys moved quickly, framing the case as a triumph of technology rather than truth, questioning the reliability of degraded samples, highlighting the absence of eyewitnesses, pointing to the long gap between the crime and the arrest as evidence of investigative failure rather than persistence. Because in court, time is not neutral, it is a weapon, and the longer a case remains unsolved, the easier it becomes to argue that the wrong person has been caught in the net of renewed attention. For the family, the arrest brought no immediate relief, only a complicated surge of emotion that resisted categorization, hope braided tightly with fear, because an arrest is a promise, not a guarantee, and they had learned too well what it felt like to trust in outcomes that never arrived. So they watched carefully, listening to every update, bracing themselves against the possibility that this chapter, too, could end without resolution. As pretrial motions stacked up, the story shifted from investigation to prosecution, from mystery to argument, and the town followed closely, divided between those who saw the arrest as long overdue justice and those who struggled to reconcile the image they held of the suspect with the accusations now attached to his name. Because community memory is stubborn, and people cling to familiarity, even when it becomes uncomfortable. Experts took the stand during hearings, explaining DNA in careful, deliberate terms, translating probabilities into language meant to sound certain. And yet certainty is a fragile thing when filtered through legal standards, and prosecutors knew they had to do more than show a match. They had to tell a story that made sense, that bridged the gap between science and motive, between data and human behavior, because juries don't convict on statistics alone, they convict on coherence. Behind closed doors, investigators revisited the night itself, walking through the sequence again and again, aligning what they believed happened with what could be proven, acknowledging where the case would always rely on inference, where the truth might remain partially obscured, because even solved cold cases retain their shadows, and not every question finds its answer in a courtroom. As the trial date approached, tensions settled into the town like a low fog, conversations hushed, eyes lingering on familiar places now imbued with new meaning. The driveway where the car had been found, the streets she had walked, the spaces that once felt ordinary and now carried the weight of association. Because when a cold case is solved, geography itself becomes evidence, transformed by context. The courtroom filled slowly on the first day, family members seated apart from those who had come out of curiosity, the defendant watching quietly as the charges were read, his expression unreadable. And in that moment the distance between 1998 and the present collapsed completely, years folding inward as the story finally entered a space designed to demand answers, to impose structure on chaos. Opening statements promise clarity, but clarity is never immediate in cases like this. It arrives in fragments, in expert testimony and cross-examination, in the careful unveiling of evidence that had waited decades to be seen. And as the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a trial about a single crime. It was a referendum on memory, on science, on whether justice delayed can still be justice delivered. Outside, the town held its breath again, the same way it had years earlier when the disappearance first shattered its sense of safety, because no matter the outcome, the process itself was already rewriting history, forcing everyone to confront how little they had known, how easily certainty can be misplaced, and how the quiet persistence of a cold case can eventually drag the truth, however uncomfortable, into the light. The trial moved forward not with spectacle, but with accumulation, detail layered upon detail until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. And every day inside the courtroom felt like a slow tightening, the kind that doesn't announce itself until breathing becomes difficult. Because this was not a case built on confession or eyewitness certainty. It was built on reconstruction, on science asked to speak for a night that no living witness could fully describe. Prosecutors began with the timeline, anchoring the jury in the final known movements of the victim, the ordinary choices that led her home, the quiet moments that preceded her disappearance, and in that ordinariness lay the horror, because nothing about the evening suggested danger, nothing foreshadowed violence, and that absence of warning became part of the argument, that the crime did not erupt from chaos, but from opportunity, from someone who did not need to force his way inside because he was already trusted. Expert witnesses followed, voices steady as they explained DNA analysis with clinical precision, how degraded samples could still yield reliable profiles, how statistical probabilities reduced coincidence to near impossibility. And the courtroom listened as numbers were translated into meaning, because while DNA may be invisible, its implications are not, and each explanation tightened the connection between the evidence and the man sitting quietly at the defense table. The defense pushed back hard, questioning collection methods from the 90s, emphasizing contamination risks, reminding the jury that science evolves and that what is considered reliable today may be challenged tomorrow. And in doing so, they tapped into a deep discomfort, the fear that progress can rewrite the past in ways that feel unfair, that someone could be judged by standards that didn't exist at the time, and that fear resonated more than anyone wanted to admit. Witnesses from the town took the stand, some reluctantly, recounting small interactions that had once seemed meaningless, a wave, a conversation, a moment of proximity that only now felt charged. And as they spoke, it became clear how memory reshapes itself under pressure, how people search their own histories for signs they might have missed, because no one wants to believe they were close to something terrible without knowing it. The suspect's demeanor never shifted dramatically, but the jury watched him closely, searching for something to anchor their intuition, because when facts become complex, people look for human cues, and the absence of emotion can be as suspicious as its presence, even though it proves nothing, and this tension between logic and instinct hovered constantly, shaping how evidence was received. Prosecutors returned repeatedly to motive, careful not to speculate too wildly, grounding their arguments in what could be shown: access, opportunity, a relationship that blurred boundaries, a familiarity that made the crime possible without noise or witnesses. And while they could not reconstruct every moment, they argued that the shape of the night was clear enough, that the gaps in the story pointed inward rather than outward. The defense countered with alternative explanations, unnamed suspects, the idea that someone else could have exploited the same opportunities, reminding the jury that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that a cold case, by definition, carries uncertainty, and they urged caution, painting the prosecution's narrative as an attempt to impose order on chaos long after the fact. As days passed, the emotional toll became visible, family members gripping each other's hands as evidence was described, jurors growing quieter, the courtroom air heavy with the awareness that no verdict could restore what had been taken, only decide responsibility, and even that felt like an imperfect form of justice after so much time. Closing arguments distill the case into its starkest form, the prosecution framing the DNA match as the voice of the victim herself, speaking across decades, refusing to be silenced, while the defense framed the same evidence as a technological echo, powerful but not infallible, urging the jury to remember the stakes, that a life now hung on probabilities and interpretations. When the jury was sent to deliberate, the waiting began again, familiar in its cruelty, echoing the years of uncertainty that had defined the case from the start. And outside the courtroom, reporters speculated, families waited, and the town felt the old tension return, sharper now, because this time there would be an answer, one way or another. Deliberations stretched on, hours turning into days, each update scrutinized for meaning, each delay interpreted as doubt or care, and inside the jury room the past and present collided. Evidence weighed not just for what it proved, but for what it implied about trust, about memory, about whether science could truly reach back far enough to correct an injustice left to harden over time. When the verdict was finally announced, the room filled again, breath held collectively, the judge's voice steady as the words were read. And in that moment the cold case crossed another threshold, not into peace, not into closure, but into consequence, because whatever the decision, it would reshape how the story was told, how it was remembered, and how the town understood the long shadow cast by a night in 1998 that had refused to stay in the past. The verdict landed without drama, just a sequence of words delivered in a neutral tone that nevertheless cut through the room like a blade, because neutrality does not soften impact. And as the decision settled, it became clear that the case had reached an end the town had imagined for years without ever truly preparing for. Guilty on the counts that mattered. A confirmation that the cold case had not been a ghost story after all, but a delayed reckoning. And the sound that followed was not applause or shouting, but something quieter. A collective exhale that carried relief, disbelief, and grief in equal measure. For the family, the moment was almost disorienting, because justice, when it arrives after decades, does not feel triumphant. It feels heavy, like an object you've been carrying without realizing its weight until you finally set it down. And even then your muscles remember the strain. And while tears came, they were not the release people expect from courtroom dramas. They were measured, restrained, shaped by years of learning how not to fall apart. The defendant barely reacted, a flicker of movement at the jaw, a tightening of the shoulders, and then stillness again. And that stillness became its own kind of statement, because when a life collapses in slow motion, the end rarely looks explosive. It looks controlled, procedural, absorbed into the machinery of law that moves forward regardless of personal catastrophe. Sentencing was scheduled for later, but the symbolic weight of the verdict was immediate. Headlines updating within minutes, phones lighting up across the town, social media filling with reactions that ranged from vindication to doubt. Because even when a cold case is declared solved, consensus does not follow automatically, and some people clung to uncertainty as if it were a form of loyalty to the past. Detectives returned to the station not to celebrate but to document, closing files that had been open for most of their careers, adding final notes that summarized years of work in paragraphs that felt inadequate. Because no report can capture the lived reality of waiting, of false starts, of nights spent wondering whether the truth would ever align with proof. The evidence was refiled, no longer dormant but resolved, boxes relabeled, shelves reorganized, and in that mundane administrative process, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the case had changed status, from question to conclusion, and that change carried a strange finality, because once a cold case is solved, it can no longer be imagined differently. The narrative hardens, becoming official history. The community reacted in uneven rhythms, some finding comfort in the idea that persistence had paid off, others unsettled by how long danger had gone unnoticed, and conversations circled the same uneasy realization that evil does not always announce itself, that it can exist quietly, woven into routine, and that recognition often arrives only in hindsight, when it is too late to intervene. Schools discuss the case in abstract terms, teachers careful to frame it as a lesson in resilience and justice rather than fear, parents explaining to children why a story from before they were born still mattered. And in doing so, the town confronted its own continuity, the way trauma can stretch across generations, shaping caution and awareness long after the original event has faded from direct memory. At the sentencing hearing, the victim's story was retold one final time, not as evidence but as impact, statements delivered with voices that shook despite careful preparation, because articulating loss does not become easier with repetition, and the defendant listened as the consequences of his actions were articulated in human terms, stripped of technical language, reduced to absence, to the years that could not be returned. The sentence reflected the gravity of the crime, a span of years that acknowledged both punishment and the reality of time already past. And as it was read, there was no sense of balance restored, only an acknowledgement that the law had done what it could, late but decisive, within the limits imposed by reality. Afterward, the courthouse emptied slowly, reporters packing up equipment, families leaving through separate doors, and outside the sky looked unchanged, indifferent to the significance attributed to the moment, because the world does not pause for justice, it absorbs it and moves on, leaving people to process its meaning privately. In the days that followed, investigators were asked the same question repeatedly, how it felt to finally solve the case, and their answers were consistent in their restraint, satisfaction tempered by awareness, because solving a cold case does not erase the years of uncertainty, it only reshapes them, turning unanswered questions into answered ones without undoing the damage caused by delay. The family returned to a quieter version of waiting, no longer waiting for answers but for normalcy, for a sense that life could proceed without the constant background hum of unfinished business, and even that adjustment carried its own challenges, because closure is not a door that closes, it is a room you learn to live in, furnished with memories that no verdict can remove. For the town, the case became part of its identity, referenced whenever discussions turned to safety, to trust, to the power of science, and while the phrase "cold case solved" appeared in bold letters across anniversary articles, it was the unsolved feeling that lingered beneath, the understanding that certainty had come at a cost measured in years and lives altered irrevocably. And as the legal chapter concluded, another began quietly, the process of integrating this truth into collective memory, of teaching future generations what happened and why it mattered, because the resolution of a cold case is not the end of its story. It is the point at which the story becomes a warning, a reminder that justice can be delayed but not erased, and that time, while it may obscure, does not absolve. Time moved again after the sentencing, awkwardly at first, like a limb waking from numbness, and the town struggled to remember how to exist without the case hovering over every conversation. Because for 25 years the mystery had been a constant, a low-frequency hum beneath daily life, and removing it did not bring silence. It brought an echo, a space where questions used to live and where new uncertainties now gathered. The man convicted became a subject of analysis rather than suspicion, his past combed through with an intensity that bordered on obsession, neighbors replaying memories in their minds, searching for signs they might have missed, moments that now seemed charged with meaning. And this collective re-examination was not about him as much as it was about reassurance, about convincing themselves that the danger had been an anomaly rather than a reflection of something more uncomfortable, something systemic and close. Documentaries were announced, podcasts reached out for interviews, national outlets requested access to files, and the story expanded beyond the town's borders, transformed into content, into narrative, into something consumable. And this new phase brought its own tension, because while exposure promised awareness, it also threatened to flatten nuance, to reduce years of lived pain into a sequence of dramatic beats. And those closest to the case felt the pull between wanting the truth known and wanting it left alone. Investigators became reluctant historians, asked to recount decisions made decades earlier, to justify delays, to explain why certain leads had gone cold while others had been pursued. And they answered carefully, aware that hindsight sharpens judgment in ways that can feel unfair, because cold cases are not puzzles solved in a vacuum. They're products of their time, constrained by technology, by resources, by the limits of human perception. The role of DNA loomed large in every retelling, celebrated as the hero of the story, the silent witness that never forgot. And while that framing was not wrong, it was incomplete, because science alone did not solve the case, persistence did. The refusal to discard evidence, the belief that time could work in favor of truth rather than against it. And this distinction mattered to those who had spent years keeping the file alive when attention drifted elsewhere. Families of other unsolved cases reached out, drawn by the possibility that their own stories might one day follow a similar arc. And in those conversations, there's a careful balance between hope and realism, because for every cold case solved, countless others remain suspended, their evidence insufficient, their answers inaccessible, and the success of one case does not guarantee resolution for another, no matter how much technology advances. The victim's name returned to public spaces in a different way now. Scholarships established, memorials planned, her story reframed not only as a tragedy but as a catalyst, and yet those closest to her understood the danger of abstraction, the way symbols can replace people, and they guarded her memory fiercely, insisting on details that preserved her humanity beyond the circumstances of her death. Within the justice system, the case became a reference point, cited in training sessions and policy discussions about evidence preservation, about the value of revisiting old files, about the ethical dimensions of genetic genealogy, because the same tools that solved this case raised questions that did not have easy answers about consent, about privacy, about how far society should go in pursuit of accountability. The convicted man filed appeals, as expected, challenging procedures, questioning interpretations, and while none immediately threatened the verdict, their existence served as a reminder that legal finality is rarely absolute, that resolution can be provisional, contingent on process, and this kept a thread of tension alive, a reminder that the past has a way of asserting itself even after judgment is passed. For the family, daily life resumed in a changed landscape, one where the question of what happened no longer dominated, but where its consequences remained embedded in routine, in anniversaries that now carried different meanings, in conversations that could finally shift away from speculation. And this adjustment required its own kind of resilience, because certainty can be as disruptive as doubt when it arrives after years of uncertainty. The town marked the passage of time with renewed awareness, recognizing that the years between crime and resolution were not empty, that they were filled with choices, with missed opportunities, with quiet acts of dedication that rarely made headlines. And this recognition complicated the narrative, turning a simple story of breakthrough into a more honest account of persistence under limitation. As attention slowly waned, as cameras moved on to newer stories, the case settled into its final form, not as a mystery, but as a lesson, one that resisted neat conclusions, because while the crime had been answered, its impact remained diffuse, influencing how people thought about safety, about trust, about the unseen histories carried by familiar faces. And in that quieter aftermath, the true legacy of the cold case emerged, not in the verdict or the headlines, but in the collective understanding that time does not erase truth. It merely delays its recognition, and that beneath the surface of ordinary life, stories can persist for decades, waiting for the precise convergence of memory, science, and resolve that finally brings them into the light. As months slipped into years after the verdict, the case didn't disappear so much as it diffused, spreading into conversations, policies, and private reflections, becoming less a headline and more a reference point, invoked whenever discussions turned to justice delayed, to the fragile boundary between certainty and assumption. And in that diffusion, the story gained a strange permanence, no longer confined to a file or a courtroom, but embedded in the town's collective consciousness. The evidence room felt different now, quieter in a way that wasn't simply about the absence of activity, because the boxes from 1998 no longer carried anticipation, they carried finality, and detectives who passed them felt a subdued satisfaction mixed with unease. Because closure in law enforcement is rarely pure, it arrives layered with questions about what might have been different if time, resources, or attention had aligned sooner. New cases arrived, urgent and loud, demanding immediate focus, and yet the solved cold case lingered as a silent comparator, reminding investigators that today's overlooked detail could become tomorrow's central proof, that the decisions made under pressure ripple forward in ways that are impossible to predict. And this awareness subtly altered how they worked, instilling a caution born not of fear but of experience. The victim's family navigated a new social reality, one where sympathy was no longer tentative but resolute, where condolences shifted into admiration for endurance, and while that support was genuine, it also carried an expectation of resolution, as if justice completed the story. And they learned to gently resist that framing, to explain that while the question of who was responsible had been answered, the question of loss had not. Public discourse around DNA technology intensified, fueled by the visibility of the case, commentators praising its precision, while critics raised alarms about surveillance and consent, and the town found itself unexpectedly at the center of a national conversation about how far society should go to correct old wrongs. A conversation that had no simple resolution and no consensus, only competing values laid bare. Law schools dissected the trial, forensic conferences cited the evidence handling, and the case became educational material, stripped of names and emotion in some contexts, analyzed for process rather than pain. And this transformation felt both validating and unsettling, because it affirmed the case's importance while simultaneously distancing it from the human cost that had made it matter in the first place. The convicted man's appeals moved slowly through the system, procedural and methodical, each filing a reminder that legal resolution is iterative rather than absolute. And while none altered the outcome, they sustained a low-level tension, a sense that the story, though largely settled, was not entirely finished, because the law allows for persistence just as investigations do. In the community, small rituals emerged, unplanned and informal, moments of remembrance that didn't require ceremonies or speeches, a bench left undisturbed, a streetlight maintained carefully, gestures that acknowledged the past without reopening it fully. And these quiet acts spoke more powerfully than official memorials ever could, because they reflected an understanding grown organically rather than imposed. Journalists returned periodically, usually around anniversaries, seeking fresh angles on a story that resisted novelty, and some found them in the aftermath, in how people had changed rather than in what had happened, because the true transformation wrought by the case was internal, altering how trust was extended, how risk was perceived, how memory was valued. Younger residents learned about the case secondhand, through parents or teachers, encountering it as history rather than lived experience, and this generational distance introduced a subtle shift, turning the story into a lesson rather than a warning. And those who remembered 1998 firsthand felt a quiet responsibility to convey its weight without transmitting its fear. Within the department, veterans retired, taking with them personal memories of the case's early days, and new detectives inherited a polished narrative rather than a raw mystery. And this transfer underscored one of the case's quiet truths, that institutions remember differently than individuals, preserving outcomes more readily than uncertainty. The cold case, once defined by absence, was now defined by presence, present in policy changes, in professional practices, in the town's self-image, and yet its core remained what it had always been, a story about vulnerability, about how quickly normalcy can fracture, and about the long, uneven path from question to answer. In moments of reflection, those closest to the investigation acknowledged that the case had offered something rare, not just resolution but perspective, a demonstration that while time complicates justice, it does not necessarily defeat it, and that persistence, when paired with evolving tools, can bridge even decades-long gaps. And so the story settled into a new phase, less urgent but no less significant, its edges softened by familiarity, but its lessons intact. A reminder that cold cases are not relics, they are promises deferred, waiting for the convergence of patience, science, and resolve that can finally turn silence into truth. With distance came reinterpretation, and the story began to change shape in subtle ways, not in facts but in meaning, as people revisited what they thought they understood about the case and about themselves, because resolution has a way of forcing reflection, of asking uncomfortable questions about complacency, about the cost of assuming safety, about the small decisions that accumulate into vulnerability without announcing themselves. Former neighbors replayed routines from 1998 with a new awareness, recalling nights that felt uneventful then, but now seemed charged in retrospect. And this mental reprocessing became a quiet, collective exercise, not about assigning blame, but about acknowledging how easily danger can blend into normalcy, how familiarity dulls vigilance until it is tested by loss. Law enforcement agencies beyond the town reached out, not just to celebrate the outcome, but to understand the process, to learn what had allowed the case to survive long enough to be solved. And the answer was less dramatic than expected: meticulous evidence preservation, documentation that resisted shortcuts, a culture that valued future possibility even when present certainty was unattainable. And these lessons traveled farther than the original crime ever had. Cold case units expanded in other jurisdictions, budgets adjusted, training emphasized patience alongside urgency. And while no single case can reshape an entire system, this one nudged the conversation forward, reinforcing the idea that unresolved cases are not failures frozen in time, but opportunities waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The victim's story continued to be told, but increasingly through the lens of impact rather than mystery, highlighting how one life, interrupted, could influence policy, technology, and awareness decades later. And while this framing offered a measure of meaning, it also underscored the imbalance at the heart of such narratives, that transformation often grows from tragedy without ever compensating for it. In private moments, investigators grappled with lingering questions that no verdict could answer: the exact sequence of events, the thoughts that passed through the victim's mind or final moments, the precise point at which intervention might have changed everything. And these questions remained unanswered not because of oversight, but because some truths are not preserved in evidence, only in imagination. The convicted man faded from public discussion, his name mentioned less frequently as attention shifted, and this fading carried its own discomfort, because while punishment was necessary, forgetting felt too close to erasure, and the community struggled to balance the desire to move forward with the obligation to remember accurately. Anniversaries arrived with a different tone now, less frantic, more reflective, gatherings smaller, conversations deeper, focusing not on what was unknown but on what had been learned, And in these moments, the town articulated a shared understanding that justice, while imperfect, had been pursued with integrity, and that integrity mattered even when outcomes were delayed. Educational programs reference the case to illustrate ethical complexity, the power and limits of forensic science, the importance of consent and oversight, and students debated scenarios that had once been lived realities, transforming experience into discourse, pain into pedagogy. And this transformation felt both necessary and unsettling, because it required distance that those closest to the case never truly had. As years passed, the legal record settled into permanence, appeals exhausted, judgments upheld, and the case reached a point of administrative stillness, and in that stillness the community found room to redefine itself, not as a place haunted by an unsolved crime, but as one shaped by its response to it, by the patience that eventually yielded clarity. The phrase cold case took on a different resonance locally, no longer shorthand for hopelessness, but for endurance, for the idea that time, when paired with intention, can be an ally rather than an enemy. And this reframing altered how unresolved cases were discussed, infusing conversations with cautious optimism rather than resignation. Yet beneath that optimism remained humility, an awareness that not every story resolves, that for many families waiting continues without promise, and this awareness fostered empathy rather than complacency, a recognition that the solved case was an exception that illuminated the rule rather than disproving it. In the end, what endured was not the spectacle of the trial or the novelty of the technology, but the quiet understanding that justice is a process rather than an event, a continuum that stretches across years, across generations, sustained by people willing to preserve truth even when its value is not immediately apparent. And so the case lived on, not as a mystery anymore, but as a measure, a benchmark against which persistence, ethics, and restraint could be evaluated, reminding all who encountered it that the past is never truly dormant. It waits, shaped by the choices made in the present, for the moment when it can finally be understood. As the case receded from daily conversation, it settled into something quieter but heavier, a reference people carried rather than discussed, and in that silence its influence became more apparent, shaping instincts in ways that rarely announce themselves, because the deepest changes are often invisible, embedded in how decisions are made rather than how stories are told. Investigators who had cut their teeth on the case approached new files differently now, lingering a moment longer on details that once might have been dismissed, preserving materials with an almost reverent care, because they had seen firsthand how the smallest fragment could one day become decisive. And this caution was not born of fear, but of respect for time as an investigative force. The town's relationship with law enforcement evolved subtly, trust no longer rooted solely in presence or familiarity, but in process, in the knowledge that answers might take years but would not be abandoned lightly. And while skepticism remained, it was tempered by evidence of persistence, by the understanding that resolution is sometimes a matter of endurance rather than immediacy. Families of unresolved cases elsewhere followed the story with measured attention, drawing strength from its outcome while guarding against false hope. And in that balance lay a quiet solidarity, an unspoken recognition that waiting is its own form of labor, one that deserves acknowledgement even when it yields no conclusion. Policy changes inspired by the case began to show results, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally. Improved evidence tracking systems, clearer guidelines for genetic genealogy, stronger safeguards around consent, and while none could guarantee justice, they reduced the chances that answers would be lost to negligence or oversight, and that mattered more than headlines ever could. The victim's legacy continued to evolve, no longer defined solely by what happened to her but by what followed, by the conversations she inspired, by the practices altered in response to her case. And this reframing offered a form of meaning that did not replace loss but coexisted with it, allowing remembrance without perpetual re-traumatization. In quiet moments, those closest to the investigation acknowledged the paradox at the heart of the case, that it required distance to be solved. That time, which had initially obscured the truth, ultimately revealed it, and this paradox resisted simple interpretation, challenging assumptions about urgency and patience that often govern responses to crime. The physical spaces tied to the case changed over time. Buildings renovated, streets repaved, landmarks erased or repurposed, and yet memory persisted independent of geography, carried by people rather than places, because while environments evolve, the imprint of shared experience remains portable, migrating across contexts without losing its weight. New generations encountered the case indirectly, through lessons, through cautionary anecdotes, through the quiet seriousness with which older residents spoke of it. And this transmission altered its tone, transforming immediacy into reflection, urgency into awareness, ensuring that while the fear faded, the understanding did not. Media interest waned, as it inevitably does, moving on to newer stories with fresher angles, and this retreat allowed the case to breathe, to exist without constant interpretation, and in that absence of scrutiny, those most affected found space to define its meaning on their own terms rather than in response to external narratives. The justice system, for all its imperfections, absorbed the case into precedent, into training materials and procedural references, and while this institutionalization risked abstraction, it also ensured continuity, embedding lessons learned into structures designed to outlast individual memory. At its core, the case came to represent a recalibration of expectations, a reminder that resolution does not arrive neatly or on schedule, that truth may require patience measured in decades, and that commitment to that patience is itself an ethical stance, a refusal to let unanswered questions harden into indifference. As time continued its steady progression, the sharp edges of the story softened without dulling its significance, and what remained was not a sensation but a principle, that justice, while vulnerable to delay, is resilient when guarded deliberately, and that the quiet work of preservation can one day speak louder than the noise of immediacy. And in that understanding, the case found its final rhythm, no longer driving conversation, but informing it, a steady undercurrent beneath the town's identity, reminding those who listen that even the coldest cases retain heat, waiting for the conditions that allow truth to surface and endure. In the end, what remained was not the shock of the arrest or the weight of the verdict, but the quiet persistence of memory, the way the case continued to surface in unguarded moments, in pauses between conversations, in an instinctive glance over a shoulder at night. Because some stories never fully conclude, they simply change how the world is perceived. The town learned to live with the knowledge that certainty had arrived late, that for years the truth had existed without recognition, moving alongside ordinary life unnoticed. And this realization altered something fundamental, replacing naive confidence with a more careful awareness, an understanding that safety is not a given but a condition maintained through attention, through vigilance, through the willingness to question what seems familiar. For those who had worked the case, the finality was intellectual rather than emotional, the satisfaction of a question answered tempered by the awareness that no answer could restore what was lost, and in that balance lay the true cost of delayed justice, a resolution that clarified responsibility without undoing damage, that spoke truth without erasing pain. The victim's name settled into permanence, no longer as a missing person or a headline, but as a reference point, a reminder invoked with care. Her story carried forward not to provoke fear, but to anchor understanding, to ensure that what happened would not dissolve into abstraction or be reduced to a statistic. Cold cases elsewhere continued to wait, files untouched on shelves, families holding onto fragments of hope, and the solved case did not mock them with false promise. It stood instead as proof of possibility, rare and conditional, dependent on preservation, on patience, on the convergence of human determination and technological evolution. In retrospect, the most unsettling truth was not how long it took to solve the case, but how easily it could have remained unsolved, how close it came to becoming just another unanswered question filed away under time. And that proximity to oblivion lent the resolution its gravity, a reminder of how fragile justice can be when attention fades. The phrase "cold case solved" lost its triumphal tone over time, becoming quieter, more reflective, understood less as a victory and more as a reckoning, a delayed alignment between truth and acknowledgement that demanded humility rather than celebration. Those who remembered 1998 most vividly carried the past differently now, not as an open wound, but as a scar that shaped movement, informed caution, and resisted forgetting. And for those who learned the story later, it became a lesson in patience, in the ethics of waiting without surrender, in the responsibility to preserve even when resolution feels distant. The justice system moved on, as it always does, absorbing the case into its vast archive of concluded matters, but the human system surrounding it did not forget so easily. Because people are not built to file away meaning, they carry it forward, integrating it into how they interpret risk, trust, and accountability. And so the story reached its true ending not in a courtroom or a headline, but in the collective acceptance of what it represented: a life interrupted, a truth delayed, a community changed, and a reminder etched quietly into shared consciousness that time does not absolve, it tests resolve. The night in 1998 did not vanish into history. It lingered, transformed by science and persistence into understanding. And that understanding became the final legacy of the case. Not closure in the comforting sense, but clarity, hard-earned and enduring. Because in the world of cold cases, resolution is never just about answers. It is about proving that silence is not permanence, that evidence remembers even when people forget, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, can still rise to the surface when patience refuses to let it disappear. Even after everything had been said, documented, archived, the case continued to assert itself in subtler ways, surfacing not as narrative but as instinct, the kind that tightens when a door closes too loudly at night, or when silence lingers a second longer than expected. Because some truths don't live in words anymore, they live in reflex. The town never returned to the version of itself that existed before 1998, and it didn't try to, because experience, once integrated, cannot be undone. It can only be accommodated, reshaping behavior quietly, influencing how neighbors look out for one another, how questions are asked sooner rather than later, how absence is taken seriously instead of assumed away. For investigators who had spent years inside the case, there was a strange aftereffect, a sense of dislocation that followed resolution, because when a long pursuit ends, momentum has nowhere to go, and purpose must be redistributed, and they carried that discipline forward, applying it to other files, other names, other silences waiting to be challenged. The evidence itself remained unchanged, preserved exactly as it had been when it finally spoke, a reminder that truth does not age the way memory does, that it waits intact for the conditions that allow it to be heard. And this understanding altered how time was regarded, not as an enemy, but as a variable that could, under the right circumstances, become an ally. Families touched by the case, directly and indirectly, learned to articulate a complex truth, that resolution and peace are not synonymous, that answers can coexist with grief without canceling it, and that the end of uncertainty does not mean the end of impact. It simply changes its shape. The story no longer needed retelling in full, because its essence had condensed into something simpler and more durable, a shared understanding that attention matters, that details matter, that patience matters, and that abandoning unanswered questions is itself a choice, one with consequences measured not immediately, but over years. In professional circles, the case continued to be cited, not for its drama, but for its restraint, for the way it demonstrated that persistence does not require spectacle, that progress can be quiet, methodical, almost invisible until it suddenly isn't, and that this kind of progress is often the most reliable. The convicted man's name faded further, no longer central to the story, because the narrative had shifted away from him, settling instead on process, on impact, on the systems that allowed truth to emerge despite delay. And in that shift, there was a deliberate refusal to let the crime define the community indefinitely. What endured most strongly was not fear, but awareness, an informed caution that resisted paranoia, a balance learned slowly through experience rather than imposed through instruction, And this balance became the town's quiet inheritance from the case. Years later, when the story was referenced, it was done so with measured tone, without sensationalism, because shock had given way to comprehension, and comprehension carried a responsibility to speak carefully, to honor complexity, rather than flatten it for effect. The cold case, once defined by what was missing, ended up defined by what remained, records preserved, questions pursued, people changed, and in that transformation lay its final significance, not as an anomaly, but as evidence of what sustained attention can achieve. And so the narrative closed not with certainty, but with resolve, a collective understanding that silence should never be mistaken for emptiness, that unanswered questions deserve guardianship, and that time, while it may delay justice, does not erase the obligation to seek it, because even the coldest cases still carry heat, waiting for someone patient enough to feel it. Long after the case slipped from headlines and academic panels moved on to newer examples, it persisted in quieter places, in training rooms where young detectives were taught to distrust assumptions, in evidence lockers where technicians logged items with a patience bordering on reverence, in conversations that began with other cases but inevitably circled back to 1998 because it had become a reference point, a reminder etched into professional muscle memory. There was no single moment when the community collectively decided to let go. Instead, release happened gradually, unevenly, in private realizations that the past no longer dictated the present with the same force, that remembrance could exist without reopening wounds every time, and that vigilance did not require living in permanent tension. The location itself changed almost imperceptibly. Renovations, new signage, fresh paint, the normal markers of time moving forward, yet certain angles of light still trigger recollection for those who remembered the original scene, because places remember differently than people do, holding impressions without narrative, without judgment. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, the resolution introduced a strange clarity about uncertainty itself, an understanding that not knowing is not a void but a state of suspended responsibility, one that demands stewardship rather than resignation, and this perspective altered how unresolved matters were approached across disciplines. Records from the case continued to be requested, studied, compared, not out of morbid curiosity, but because they demonstrated something rare, a clean line between evidence and inference, a disciplined refusal to inflate partial truths into conclusions, and this restraint became the case's most enduring lesson. The victim's name remained protected from casual use, spoken carefully, contextually, because the story had matured beyond spectacle, and in that maturity, there was an unspoken agreement that dignity mattered more than exposure. The remembrance carried obligations beyond accuracy. Even the technology that ultimately broke the silence was no longer novel, its use now standardized, refined, regulated, but the case retained its relevance because it illustrated the moment when possibility became practice, when theory crossed into application with irreversible consequences. There were moments, years later, when unrelated investigations echoed patterns from 1998, similar gaps, similar delays, similar frustrations, and those echoes were met not with despair but with calibrated patience, because experience had redefined expectations, replacing urgency with persistence. The case did not inspire fear in future generations. It inspired attentiveness, a subtle but crucial difference, one that shaped how information was shared, how tips were evaluated, how silence was interpreted not as absence, but as potential signal. When the story was eventually archived in full, its final entry did not declare closure in absolute terms, because absolute closure was never the point. Instead, it documented continuity, the understanding that justice is not a destination, but a process that unfolds unevenly, shaped by human limits and human resolve. And in that framing, the 1998 cold case found its final place, not as an outlier, not as a warning frozen in time, but as a living example of what happens when questions are carried forward instead of abandoned, when patience outlasts doubt, and when the past, confronted carefully, releases its grip just enough to allow the future to proceed. With distance came a quieter kind of authority, the kind earned not through repetition but through absorption, as the case settled into institutional memory, no longer debated, no longer dissected, but understood, its contours familiar enough to guide judgment without needing to be summoned explicitly. New investigators encountered it indirectly, through habits rather than lectures, through the way veterans paused before closing a file, the way they resisted tidy explanations, the way they left room for the possibility that time might reveal what pressure could not. And in this manner the case continued to teach without speaking. The community's relationship to law enforcement shifted in subtle ways, expectations recalibrated, trust grounded not in promises, but in demonstrated endurance, and this recalibration mattered because it replaced spectacle with accountability, demanding consistency over charisma. There were anniversaries that passed unnoticed, dates that once would have triggered media interest now acknowledged only in private, because the need to perform remembrance had given way to something steadier, a recognition that memory does not require ceremony to persist. Data from the case informed policy decisions far removed from its origin, influencing how evidence retention was funded, how cold cases were prioritized, how cross-jurisdictional cooperation was formalized, and these structural changes represented the most tangible legacy, proof that individual outcomes could reshape systems. The emotional residue never fully disappeared, nor was it expected to, but transformed, losing its sharpness, becoming something closer to gravity, a constant presence that influenced movement without dominating it, allowing life to proceed without denial. Even skepticism found its place, not as obstruction but as discipline, a learned resistance to premature certainty that protected future investigations from the mistakes of haste, reinforcing the idea that doubt, properly managed, is a tool rather than a weakness. When the case was mentioned in passing, it was with an economy of language that reflected respect, an understanding that excessive detail could distort meaning, that clarity often requires restraint, and that the most powerful truths are those that do not need embellishment. The passage of years revealed an unexpected outcome, a normalization of patience, a collective comfort with extended timelines that stood in contrast to a culture accustomed to immediacy. And this comfort altered how success was measured, valuing thoroughness over speed. What had once been an open wound became a reference scar, visible but no longer inflamed, a marker of experience rather than injury, signaling survival rather than vulnerability. And in this state, the case continued to exist, not actively, not urgently, but securely, embedded within the shared understanding that some answers arrive late, some justice unfolds slowly, and that commitment, sustained without spectacle, remains the most reliable force against silence. By the time the case reached this far edge of memory, it no longer needed advocates, because its influence had diffused completely, absorbed into routine decisions, quiet checks, unspoken hesitations that prevented errors before they could form. And in that diffusion lay its final transformation, from story to standard. The language surrounding unresolved crimes changed subtly in its wake, less absolutist, more precise, acknowledging uncertainty without surrendering to it. And this shift mattered because words shape posture, and posture determines whether persistence feels like burden or obligation. Those who had lived through the earliest years noticed the difference most clearly. The absence of panic when leads went cold, the refusal to dramatize delay, the confidence that time, properly managed, could still be productive. And this confidence replaced the older fear that unanswered questions meant failure. Institutions learned to document more carefully, to preserve context alongside evidence, understanding that future eyes would need more than objects. They would need clarity about decisions, about why certain paths were taken and others left unexplored. And this foresight became a safeguard against repetition of past blind spots. The case's final contribution was not technological or procedural, but philosophical, a recalibration of how closure was defined, no longer as a moment of revelation, but as an ongoing alignment between truth, responsibility, and care, maintained rather than achieved. In private moments, Individuals connected to the case still experience flashes of recognition, a sound, a phrase, a pause that echoed earlier years, but these moments no longer destabilize them. Instead, they reinforce an understanding earned slowly. That memory can inform without overwhelming. The public, too, adapted, learning to accept narratives without neat endings, to respect investigations that move deliberately rather than theatrically. And this acceptance created space for seriousness, reducing the pressure to convert complexity into spectacle. What remained unresolved was no longer framed as deficit, but as condition, a reality acknowledged without frustration, because effort had replaced expectation, and effort, sustained honestly, had proven its worth. As the last administrative tasks were completed, and the files settled permanently into archives, there was no ceremony, no declaration, just a shared recognition that the work had been done as fully as it could be. Given the limits of knowledge and time, the cold case, once defined by absence, concluded its long arc defined by presence. Present in systems improved, in habits refined, in patience normalized, and this presence ensured that its impact would continue without needing retelling. And so the voice that once chased answers receded, not into silence, but into continuity, leaving behind a steady reminder that justice does not always arrive loudly, that resolution does not erase history, and that the truest measure of a case is not how it ends, but how it changes what follows. Even after the file was sealed and its physical weight reduced to a label on a shelf, the case retained a kind of quiet motion, not moving forward, not backward, but circulating through professional instinct, through the way certain questions were asked twice, through the way silence was never allowed to settle unquestioned. Time continued to do what it always does, advancing without regard for resolution, carrying new cases, new urgencies, new names into focus. Yet the discipline forged in the aftermath of 1998 remained intact, informing judgment with an awareness that haste and neglect are often indistinguishable in their consequences. There were moments when fragments resurfaced unexpectedly, an old report referenced in a new investigation, a procedural note echoed in training material, and each resurfacing served not to reopen wounds, but to reaffirm a standard, a reminder that thoroughness is cumulative, built layer by layer across years. The community's collective memory thinned but did not disappear, becoming less specific, more atmospheric, a shared understanding that something significant had happened, something that reshaped expectations even if the details blurred. And this atmosphere influenced behavior more reliably than facts ever could. Younger generations encountered the story only indirectly, through cautionary language, through institutional habits that favored verification over assumption. And in this way the case achieved a rare longevity, existing without needing to be narrated in full, sustained by the practices it helped shape. The absence that once defined the investigation no longer felt like a void, but like a boundary, clearly marked, respected, a recognition of what was known, what was proven, and what would remain uncertain. And this clarity prevented speculation from filling space that evidence could not occupy. Professionals who reflected on the case years later described not triumph, but steadiness, a sense that the work had aligned correctly with responsibility, that nothing essential had been rushed or abandoned, and that this alignment mattered more than any singular outcome. Even the emotional vocabulary surrounding the case evolved, less focused on shock, more on consequence, acknowledging that the true impact of long investigations is measured not in dramatic reveals, but in sustained attention and disciplined care. The case's influence extended quietly into policy discussions, funding decisions, procedural reforms, often without explicit attribution, because its lessons had become embedded, no longer needing citation to justify their relevance. What endured was a collective refusal to equate time with irrelevance, an understanding that delay does not diminish obligation, and that unanswered questions, when carried responsibly, retain their moral weight regardless of age. And so the story continued, not as a narrative demanding retelling, but as a presence woven into the fabric of practice and memory, a reminder that some cases never truly end, They simply change form, persisting as standards, as caution, as quiet insistence that attention, once given fully, never entirely fades.